Welcome in, everyone. Grab a seat. I am absolutely thrilled to be your professor today for our graduate-level seminar on hermeneutics. Today, we're prying open the interpretive toolkit. We're going to look really closely at how we read, who exactly is doing the reading, and the age-old question of where the meaning of a text actually lives. But before we jump straight into the deep end of literary theory, I do want to give a quick shout out to our guest lecturer and sponsor for today's session. This explainer is provided by English Lit on YouTube. They're just a fantastic resource for breaking down the actual mechanics of literature. All right, let's set our baseline. What even is hermeneutics? Put simply, it's the discipline that studies understanding and textual interpretation. And it covers the whole shebang, from ancient scriptural and legal texts right up to the modern literature we'll be discussing today. Now, its roots trace way back to classical times, sure, but the dominant tradition we rely on today really took shape with modern German philosophy. Think heavy hitters like Schleiermacher and Heidegger. Basically, it's the foundational science of figuring out what a text actually means. So, here's our syllabus for today's explainer. 1. Categorizing the reader. 2. Reception theory versus formalism. 3. Fixed meaning versus significance. 4. Suspicion versus restorative interpretation. And finally, 5. A summary of readers. Moving right into Section 1, categorizing the reader. Who is actually reading the text? Now, that sounds like a ridiculously simple question, right? You pick up a book, you read it, boom, you are the reader. But in the realm of contemporary critical theory, it's way more complex than that. Theories like reader response and reception aesthetics give us this really rich panoply of reader types. We've got virtual readers, real readers, historical readers who picked up the book on launch day, critical readers, the list goes on. But let's zoom in on a few of the absolute most important ones. First up, the implied reader. And what's wild here is that the implied reader isn't necessarily you or me sitting on the couch with a paperback. It's a hypothetical figure that the text itself seems to be directly addressing. Sometimes, this reader even acts as a literal character within the work. A textbook example of this is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. When Marlowe is telling his story, he's speaking to very specific characters on a boat. Those characters act as the implied listeners or readers hardwired right into the architecture of the story. Contrast that with the ideal reader. This is basically the hypothetical perfect decoder of a work. This reader knows absolutely everything required to make complete 100% sense of the text. And our source material highlights something super interesting. The most original, boundary-pushing texts actually demand what theorists call a super reader. This is an ideal reader who doesn't just have a massive vocabulary, but a highly superior aesthetic sensibility to fully grasp what the author is throwing down. Then we have the resisting reader. This is a reader firmly planted in a specific historical moment, carrying their own strong, deeply held values. And because of those values, they actively oppose and interrogate the text. To impartially look at this, our source asks us to imagine an average modern American or Briton picking up Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf. That modern reader brings historically situated values to the table, which forces them to resist and interrogate the dangerous ideologies in that text, rather than just passively absorbing them. Section 2, Reception Theory versus Formalism. Where does meaning reside? So now that we know who is reading, we've got to ask, where does the meaning actually live? Is it locked inside the words on the page, or does the reader kind of conjure it up? This is literally one of the biggest academic tugs of wars in literary theory. On the left corner, we have reception theory. These theorists argue that meaning is an event. It's a process. Some even argue it depends entirely on pre-existing social codes. Like, a community of psychoanalytical critics will use their specific lens to literally produce the meaning of a text. But over in the right corner, we have formalism, specifically the new critics. They see meaning as an objective artifact. They strictly forbid us from finding meaning in the reader's emotions. They call that the affective fallacy, or in the author's intentions, which is the intentional fallacy. For new critics, the literary artifact stands completely alone. And that strict view leads directly to a famous warning from the new critics, the heresy of paraphrase. They argue it is a huge mistake to paraphrase a work just to boil it down to a simple utilitarian message. Why? Because the moment you turn a beautiful, complex poem into a generic moral statement, you put literature in direct competition with philosophy or politics. And worse, you completely ruin the complex, aesthetic unity of the work. The text is the text. You just can't reduce it. Section 3. Fixed Meaning, Evolving Significance. E.D. Hurst Jr.'s Two Levels of Reading.
Okay, so if formalists think meaning is this unchangeable artifact, and reception theorists think it's a totally subjective event, is there a middle ground? Well, yeah. It comes from the conservative philological tradition, specifically through a hermeneuticist named E.D. Hirsch Jr. Hirsch brilliantly splits our understanding into two distinct buckets. On one side, we have meaning. This is a fixed, reproducible object derived strictly from what the author intended. It literally never changes. But on the other side, we have significance. And significance absolutely changes over time. It takes that fixed meaning and adds the reader's personal associations, their historical context, their modern values. So a text written 2 centuries ago means exactly what the author originally intended, but its significance to us right now might be wildly different than it was back then.
Because of this split, Hirsch argues that readers operate on a two-step hierarchy. Step 1 is objective historical reconstruction, basically doing the detective work to find that fixed meaning. Step 2 is adding those secondary personal associations to determine the significance. And it's important to note, Hirsch places priority firmly on Step 1. Nailing down that objective historical reconstruction is the higher, much more critical task. Moving to Section 4, Suspicion versus Restorative Interpretation. How do we apply critical lenses? We've covered the reader, we've covered the meaning. Now, how do we actively apply critical lenses? When we stare at a page, what are we trying to achieve? A massive contribution here comes from Paul Ricoeur, who draws a really brilliant distinction. On one end, we have the hermeneutics of suspicion. This is heavily tied to Marxism, psychoanalysis, and post-structuralism. The goal here is negative, but in an analytical way. You want to demystify illusions, uncover unconscious motivations, and expose hidden ideologies. You're looking through the text to catch what it's secretly trying to pull off. On the flip side, we have positive restorative interpretation. This approach is all about accessing sources of life, utopian impulses, possibilities of joy, and communal dialogue. Instead of paranoid looking through, it's a deeply appreciative looking at the text.
But what happens if you try to do both at the same time? Well, the academic Frederick Jameson offers a fascinating take. In his work, The Political Unconscious, he builds on Ricoeur and says that a Marxist negative hermeneutic, analyzing the hidden ideologies, must be exercised simultaneously with a positive hermeneutic, which tries to find the utopian impulses buried in those exact same texts. It's an intense dual-lens approach that adds a highly political, future-oriented reader to our list.
Now, in recent decades, literary studies started zooming in on cultural studies, specifically looking at vernacular interpretive communities. These are non-academic, everyday readers. The source gives a great example. Janice Radway's study of 42 lower-middle-class Midwestern women who read romance novels. Radway found that these readers didn't care about elite literary style or objective distance. Not at all. They read for fantasy, pleasure, escape, and therapy in a world where they felt constantly drained. These vernacular readers were actively deploying a positive, restorative lens to find relaxation. And for them, meaning and significance are completely blended together.
Finally, Section 5, Summary of Reader Types. Let's look at the Masterclass cheat sheet. We have covered so much ground today on how texts are interpreted, so let's bring it all together with our Masterclass cheat sheet. First, the implied reader. That's the figure addressed directly by the text. Second, the ideal reader, the hypothetical perfect decoder, who sometimes needs a super reader's aesthetic chops. Third, the resisting reader, someone deeply rooted in their historical moment who pushes back and interrogates the text based on their values. And fourth, the vernacular reader, everyday, non-elite groups reading for pleasure, escape, and restorative meaning. Every single one of these readers can look at the exact same words on a page and engage with them in fundamentally different ways.
Which leaves us with one final and honestly pretty crucial question to wrap up our explainer today. What kind of reader are you? Seriously, next time you open a book, take a second and ask yourself, are you digging for E.D. Hirsch's fixed historical meaning, or are you layering on your own evolving significance? Are you applying a hermeneutic of suspicion to expose hidden agendas, or are you a vernacular reader just seeking a restorative escape? Your interpretive toolkit is now wide open. The question is, how are you going to use it? Thanks for joining the seminar today. Class dismissed.